At the twilight of the 13th century, Anatolia stood at a crossroads of history. Once the heartland of the Seljuk Turks, the land had fallen into disarray. The Mongol invasions had shattered empires, and the Byzantine state, once proud and powerful, clung desperately to its last strongholds along the western frontier. Villages lay scattered across rolling plains, fortresses guarded mountain passes, and nomadic tribes moved with their flocks between valleys. It was a world fragmented, uncertain, and waiting for a new power to emerge. Among these tribes was the Kayı, a small branch of the Oghuz Turks. They were not wealthy, nor were they numerous. Their tents were simple, their herds modest. Yet they carried with them a proud tradition of resilience, faith, and warrior spirit. The Kayı had long survived on the edge of great powers, sometimes fighting for the Seljuks, sometimes resisting Byzantines, and always striving to preserve their independence. Their leader, Ertugrul, had carved out a foothold for them in the region of Söğüt, near the Byzantine borderlands. Under his guidance, the Kayı secured a fragile existence, tilling the land, tending sheep, and defending themselves from raiders. Ertugrul was a man of vision, but his greatest legacy would not be in the land he held, but in the son who would succeed him. That son was Osman. Osman was born into hardship. He knew the cold winds of the Anatolian plateau, the endless migrations of nomads, the uncertainty of living between mighty neighbors. He was not raised in marble halls or stone palaces. His youth was spent in tents of felt, among warriors who prized loyalty above all else. From an early age, Osman showed both strength of body and clarity of mind. He trained with the sword and the bow, rode across the plains, and absorbed the stories of his ancestors, tales of honor, faith, and destiny. When Ertugrul passed away, the responsibility of leadership fell upon Osman. For some, it was an uncertain choice. The Kayı were small, their enemies many, and their allies few. Yet Osman carried himself with the quiet authority of one chosen by fate. His presence alone inspired confidence. He was not merely a warrior, but a man who believed deeply in the justice of his cause. The elders of the tribe gathered in council, seated on rugs inside the great tent. The air was thick with incense and the flicker of lamplight. One by one, voices rose, some calling for caution, others urging boldness. At the center stood Osman, tall and broad-shouldered, his beard still dark with youth, his eyes burning with conviction. He swore before them all. He would protect the Kayı, defend their faith, and carve for them a future free from fear. That oath marked the beginning of something far greater than the tribe could yet imagine. In the year 1299, Osman was formally recognized as Bey, the leader of his people. To the outside world, it was a minor event, a chieftain taking his father's place, just another page in the endless story of Anatolia's shifting powers. But to his followers, it was the dawn of a new era. In time, historians would look back and see this as the birth of the Ottoman Empire. Osman's leadership was not founded on wealth or numbers. He possessed neither. Instead, he ruled through faith and justice. His men called him a Ghazi, a warrior of Islam, fighting not only for survival but for a higher cause. In every judgment he rendered, in every decision he made, Osman sought fairness. He punished theft, protected the weak, and rewarded loyalty. Slowly, his people began to see him not just as their leader, but as the embodiment of their hopes. Life in those early days was still humble. The Kayı lived in yurts, their herds grazing on the hillsides. Women wove carpets and prepared food. Men trained in arms and guarded the camp. Children played by the fires, listening to tales of heroes and prophets. But beneath this simple existence pulsed a growing sense of destiny. Osman was not content with survival alone. He dreamed of more, of a state that could endure, of a people united under one banner. The Byzantines looked upon him as a nuisance, a minor tribal leader with ambitions larger than his means. But Osman saw opportunity in their underestimation. He understood the weakness of empires that had grown complacent. The Seljuks had collapsed, the Byzantines were stretched thin, and the Mongols, though fierce, could not watch every frontier. In that fractured world, Osman glimpsed the chance to build something lasting. The chronicles tell of a dream Osman once had. He saw a great tree growing from his chest, its branches spreading across the world, shading mountains and rivers, casting its leaves over distant lands. Whether myth or vision, this dream became a symbol of his mission. To his people, it meant that Osman was chosen, destined to create a dynasty that would outlive them all. And so, with little more than determination, faith, and the loyalty of his tribe, Osman stepped into history. His rise was quiet, almost unnoticed by the great powers of his day. But within the small encampment at Söğüt, a flame had been lit. A flame that, in time, would become a blaze stretching across continents. From humble beginnings, Osman I took the first steps on a path that would transform a wandering tribe into an empire. His story begins not with grandeur, but with an oath, a vision, and the unshakable belief that even the smallest of peoples could change the fate of the world. When Osman took the mantle of leadership in 1299, he inherited not an empire, but a fragile tribe on the margins of Anatolia. The Kayı were small in number, their lands modest, their future uncertain. To the east, remnants of the Seljuk state lingered in weakness. To the west, the Byzantine fortresses stood defiant, their stone walls guarding ancient cities. Beyond them all, the Mongol shadow loomed, a constant reminder that great powers could rise and fall overnight. Osman's first task was not conquest, but survival. He understood that before his people could dream of greatness, they had to endure the trials of the present. And so, he turned his attention inward, to the unity of his tribe, to the strengthening of their spirit, and to the building of trust among his followers. Inside the great tent of council, Osman listened more than he spoke. Elders with white beards debated fiercely. Should the tribe remain cautious, avoiding conflict with Byzantium, or should they seize opportunity, striking when their enemies least expected it? Osman absorbed every word. He was not a ruler who imposed his will recklessly. He sought consensus, but he also knew when to decide with firmness. And when his moment came, he declared with quiet conviction that the Kayı could no longer live as mere wanderers. They must establish themselves, not as subjects of a greater power, but as the beginnings of something new. To his people, Osman was not only a warrior. He was a man of deep faith. In moments of uncertainty, he would retreat into prayer, kneeling on simple rugs, whispering invocations beneath the flicker of an oil lamp. The Imam of Söğüt would later say that Osman carried himself not as a conqueror, but as a servant of God, entrusted with guiding his flock. It was this combination, strength in battle and humility before faith, that drew loyalty from his followers. In the early years of his rule, Osman established the foundations of law. These were not yet the great codes of later sultans, but simple rules of justice, protection of property, fairness in trade, respect for the weak. A thief caught in the market was punished, but a poor farmer struggling to pay was given leniency. Soldiers who fought bravely were rewarded with land, while those who shirked duty were shamed before their peers. Gradually, a sense of order took hold. The tribe's daily life remained modest. Woolen tents dotted the plains, flocks grazed on hillsides, and traders bartered in open-air markets. Women wove carpets with intricate designs, their patterns carrying the memory of ancestral migrations. Blacksmiths forged blades that gleamed in the firelight, while children listened to stories of prophets and heroes. And always, in the center of camp, the banner of Osman stood, a white cloth marked with the crescent, fluttering in the Anatolian wind. Osman's reputation grew not only among his own people, but also among neighboring tribes. Some saw him as a threat, others as a potential ally. Slowly, bey after bey came to Söğüt, offering their swords in exchange for protection and guidance. They found in Osman not a tyrant, but a leader who valued loyalty and justice. His charisma was quiet, but undeniable. Those who met him often left convinced that he was destined for greatness. The Byzantines, meanwhile, regarded Osman with disdain. To them, he was merely another Turkish chieftain, one of many who raided border villages and tested the edges of their defenses. They underestimated him, failing to see that Osman was different. Not a mere raider, but a builder of a state. This underestimation would prove costly. There is a tale often told of Osman's dream during these years. One night, he slept in the house of Sheikh Idbali, a respected religious scholar and his future father-in-law. Osman dreamed of a great tree springing from his chest, its branches stretching across mountains and rivers, shading vast lands under its leaves. When he awoke, Idbali interpreted the vision. Osman was chosen by God to found a dynasty whose power would spread far and wide. Whether myth or prophecy, the dream gave his followers a sense of destiny. They were not merely surviving. They were participants in a divine story unfolding before their eyes. Osman's marriage to Malhun Hatun further strengthened his position. She brought not only companionship but also alliances, weaving family ties into the fabric of politics. Their son, Orhan, was born into this growing legacy, the embodiment of both bloodline and vision. Osman raised him not in luxury, but in discipline, teaching him the sword, the saddle, and the importance of faith. Orhan's future would be shaped by the example of a father who led by both word and deed. But challenges remained constant. Byzantine raids tested the borders, while rival tribes sometimes resisted Osman's authority. There were nights when the sound of distant hooves carried fear into the camp, and mornings when smoke rose from burned-out villages. Each time, Osman responded with both caution and courage, striking swiftly when necessary, but always mindful that reckless ambition could doom them all. Step by step, year by year, Osman transformed the Kayı from a fragile tribe into a community bound by loyalty, law, and faith. His leadership was not marked by sudden conquest or grand spectacle, but by the steady building of foundations. He understood that empires are not created overnight. They grow from seeds planted in the soil of discipline and belief. By the early years of the 14th century, whispers spread beyond Anatolia. Other Turkish tribes spoke of Osman's justice, and Byzantine commanders began to take note of his raids with growing unease. The world was beginning to notice the man whom history would later call Osman Gazi, the warrior of faith, the founder of a dynasty. And so, in these first years of his rule, Osman set his people upon a path from survival to destiny. The boy who had grown up among yurts and flocks now stood as a leader shaping the future. The tribes of Anatolia had seen many chiefs rise and fall, but in Osman, they sensed something different, something enduring, something that would, in time, change the world. By the dawn of the 14th century, Osman's tribe no longer lived only in tents and pastures. They had begun to strike deeper into the lands once firmly held by the Byzantines. Raids on villages and border posts became more frequent, and with each clash, Osman's name spread further. To his people, he was no longer simply a bey. He was becoming a symbol of destiny. But expansion was never without resistance. The Byzantine state, though weakened, was far from powerless. Local commanders viewed Osman as a growing menace. What had once seemed a nuisance now became a threat to their authority. Tension along the frontier rose, and it would soon culminate in a confrontation that would mark a turning point not only for Osman, but for the history of Anatolia itself. The stage was set in 1302, on the plains near Bapheus, close to Nicomedia. Reports reached Constantinople that Osman's raiders had grown bold, threatening trade routes and pressing toward Byzantine towns. In response, Emperor Andronikos II dispatched a force to crush him. Byzantine soldiers, supported by local Greek levies, gathered under the command of a seasoned general. Their numbers were greater, their armor heavier, their banners emblazoned with the cross shimmering in the sun. Osman, however, was undeterred. He gathered his warriors, perhaps 5,000 men, most of them light cavalry. They were not clad in shining mail, but in leather and wool, armed with curved sabers, lances, and bows. Their strength lay not in armor, but in mobility, faith, and the will to fight for survival. Standing before his men, Osman spoke not of riches, but of duty. We fight not only for land, but for the honor of our people, and for the path God has set before us. His words lit a fire in the hearts of his warriors. On the day of battle, the plains of Bapheus trembled beneath the thunder of hooves. The Byzantines formed disciplined ranks, their spears braced, their shields locked. Behind them, mercenaries from nearby towns prepared to join the fight. Osman's cavalry, however, did not charge recklessly. They circled, harassing with arrows, probing the enemy's line. Dust rose into the air, obscuring vision, unsettling the heavily armored soldiers unused to such tactics. Then, with a cry that echoed across the field, "Allahu Akbar!" Osman led the charge. His horse surged forward, his sword flashing in the midday sun. Around him, waves of cavalry crashed into the Byzantine flank. Shields splintered, spears fell, and the ordered line began to buckle. The Byzantines counterattacked, but the light Ottoman horsemen darted away, regrouped, and struck again from another angle. Hours passed in chaos. The air was filled with the clash of steel, the cries of men, and the roar of horses. Slowly, the momentum shifted. The Byzantines, encumbered by heavy armor and disoriented by dust and heat, began to falter. Panic rippled through their ranks as Osman's warriors pressed harder. Once a few companies broke and fled, the rest followed. What began as a battle ended as a rout. When the dust settled, the field of Bapheus belonged to Osman. For the Byzantines, it was a humiliating defeat. For the Ottomans, it was their first great victory, a triumph that gave them not only land but legitimacy. The battle proved that Osman was no mere raider, but the leader of a rising power. In the aftermath, Ottoman control expanded into Bithynia, a fertile region long under Byzantine influence. Villages and towns, sensing the shift in power, began to align themselves with Osman. Some opened their gates willingly, others fell after short sieges. Each conquest brought new territory, new subjects, and new opportunities. The victory at Bapheus also had a psychological impact. To the Byzantines, it was a warning. The Turks were no longer at the gates, they were inside, carving out a realm of their own. To Osman's followers, it was a sign of divine favor. Imams and poets alike spoke of the triumph as the work of God's will, a reward for faith and courage. The banner of Osman, once carried by a small tribe, now flew proudly over captured fortresses. Expansion did not stop with Bapheus. Osman's forces pushed toward Bursa, one of the richest cities of the region. Though he would not live to see its final capture, the long siege began under his watch. Control of Bursa would eventually become a jewel in the crown of the early Ottoman state, but even in Osman's time, the pressure he placed on the city demonstrated his ambition. Beyond the battlefield, Osman ensured that conquest did not descend into chaos. New lands were not merely plundered, they were organized. Peasants were offered protection in exchange for loyalty. Markets were restored, taxes collected fairly, and religious tolerance, pragmatic as it was, encouraged local populations to accept Ottoman authority. What Osman built was not just a war machine, but the skeleton of a functioning state. By the early 1310s, the reputation of Osman stretched far beyond Anatolia. Other Turkish tribes looked to him as a leader of leaders, while Byzantine commanders feared his raids across their weakened frontiers. The Mongols, though still dominant in the east, paid little attention to the small but rising principality, a mistake that allowed Osman room to grow. And so, from the clash at Bapheus onward, Osman I transformed his people from a tribe of survivors into a force of destiny. His victories were not merely tactical, they were symbolic, affirming that the dream of empire was possible. Step by step, raid by raid, siege by siege, he carved out the foundations of what would one day become one of the greatest empires in history. The boy who once herded flocks on the plains of Söğüt was now the conqueror of Bapheus, the terror of Byzantine garrisons, and the founder of a rising power. The tree of his dream had begun to grow, its roots in Anatolia, its branches stretching toward lands yet unseen. Victory on the battlefield gave Osman land and followers. But to transform conquest into stability, he needed more than the sword. He needed order, he needed law, and above all, he needed faith to bind his people together. In the early years of his reign, Osman began shaping the foundations of what would later be called the Kanun, the laws of the Ottoman state. These were not yet the codified systems of later sultans, but simple principles rooted in justice and custom. For Osman, ruling was not merely about taking territory. It was about creating a society in which his people could live with dignity. The council tent often became his court. Disputes were brought before him. A quarrel over land, a theft from the market, a conflict between neighboring tribes. Osman listened patiently, weighing the words of elders, then rendering judgment. He was stern against injustice but merciful to the poor. A thief who stole from greed might be punished harshly, yet a farmer who stole out of hunger was given food instead of lashes. These decisions spread his reputation as a fair ruler, one who governed not with cruelty but with balance. Trade was encouraged. Merchants who passed through Söğüt were guaranteed protection so long as they paid their dues. Roads were kept safe, markets monitored, and agreements sealed with the trust of Osman's word. For a land long fractured by chaos, this sense of security was revolutionary. But Osman's vision of rule was never separated from his faith. He saw his mission not simply as the expansion of territory, but as a holy duty. He was a Ghazi, a warrior of Islam, and believed that his conquests carried divine sanction. Each victory was attributed not to his skill alone, but to God's will. Sheikh Bali, a respected religious scholar and spiritual guide, played a crucial role in Osman's outlook. Osman often spent nights in his company, listening to sermons, discussing the Quran, and seeking wisdom. It was in Adebali's home, according to tradition, that Osman experienced his famous dream of the great tree spreading its branches across the world. Whether vision or legend, the dream became a symbol of faith guiding ambition. Religion under Osman was not only private devotion but public institution. Small wooden mosques were built in villages, serving as both houses of worship and centers of community. Imams were supported, students encouraged, and the call to prayer echoed across lands newly brought under Ottoman rule. This religious foundation gave his people a sense of unity greater than bloodline or tribe. They were not only the Kayı, they were part of a community bound by faith. Osman also understood the importance of tolerance. In newly conquered lands, Christians and other groups were not eradicated, but taxed and allowed to continue their practices under Ottoman oversight. This pragmatism made it easier for local populations to accept Ottoman authority, even if reluctantly. It was not a rule of blind conquest, but of layered governance, faith guiding law and law guiding daily life. The canon and religion worked together to create legitimacy. When Osman declared judgment, it was seen not as the whim of a chieftain, but as the decision of a ruler acting under God's will and within the bounds of justice. His people believed that to obey him was to follow a path sanctified by faith. As his territory grew, so too did the need for structure. Taxation was introduced not to oppress, but to sustain the army and support the poor. Agricultural lands were divided carefully, ensuring that soldiers were rewarded with fiefs while farmers were not stripped of their livelihoods. These practices foreshadowed the Timar system that would later define Ottoman administration. Osman's leadership blended the sword with the book, the warrior with the imam. He was feared by enemies, but among his own he was respected as a just bey. This balance was the secret to his endurance. Many chiefs could win battles. Few could govern with wisdom. Osman did both. By the time his hair had begun to gray, his people no longer saw themselves as a wandering tribe. They saw themselves as a community with laws, faith, and a shared destiny. In the fires of war, Osman had forged not just an army, but the skeleton of a state. And at its heart stood two pillars, Kanun and Islam, law and faith, upon which an empire would rise. Away from the clash of swords and the dust of battlefields, the story of Osman I was also written in the daily rhythms of ordinary life. For while he built his realm through war and law, it was in the markets, the workshops, the households, and the fireside tales that the fabric of Ottoman culture first began to weave itself together. The villages of Söğüt and its surrounding lands were modest, but they pulsed with vitality. On market days, traders arrived from neighboring regions, bringing sacks of grain, jars of honey, bolts of woven cloth, and the vibrant spices of Anatolia. Stalls lined the open square, shaded by canvas awnings. The air was filled with the calls of merchants, the bleating of sheep, the clang of metalware, and the sweet aroma of bread baking in clay ovens. For the first time in years, people felt safe enough to trade openly, confident that Osman's justice would protect their goods. In the corners of these markets, craftsmen labored at their trades. The blacksmith's forge glowed with orange fire as iron was hammered into swords and plowshares. Sparks leapt in the darkness, echoing the rhythm of war and peace. Nearby, weavers worked looms, their hands pulling threads into carpets adorned with ancestral patterns, geometric motifs that told silent stories of migration, survival, and hope. Potters shaped clay into bowls and jars, the hum of their work mingling with the noise of children chasing one another across the square. These humble crafts were not only the backbone of daily life, but the seeds of a culture that would one day define an empire. Family life thrived within these villages. Houses were still simple, timber walls, stone bases, roofs of wood or thatch, but they were homes built on stability rather than fear. Mothers kneaded dough on wooden tables, their children sitting nearby, playing with carved toys or listening to folktales. Men, when not tending flocks or standing guard, gathered with neighbors to discuss village affairs or share news from the frontier. Around the evening fire, elders told stories of their ancestors, weaving history into memory. In such moments, the young learned not only who they were, but who they might become. Festivals marked the turning of seasons. During spring, tribes gathered for celebrations where music and dance filled the night. The sound of the saz, a long-necked lute, carried across the plains, while drums beat steady rhythms for dancers circling the fire. Warriors sang of battles past, while women performed songs of longing and love. These gatherings were more than entertainment. They were acts of remembrance, affirmations that their people endured, no matter how the world shifted around them. Religion also found its place in daily life, not only in mosques but in the simplest of routines. A farmer paused from his work to raise his hands in prayer as the call to worship echoed across the hills. Families gathered for communal meals at the end of fasting days, sharing bread and soup with the poor. Faith was not an abstraction. It was the pulse of daily existence, the quiet force that sustained the community as surely as water and bread. Oral tradition flourished. In the evenings, storytellers recited tales of the prophet and of legendary heroes. Children learned by heart the deeds of past warriors, carrying them forward as guiding examples. Among these tales, Osman himself began to appear, his victories retold with reverence, his fairness praised as a sign of divine favor. Even in his own lifetime, he was becoming a figure of legend, woven into the songs and stories of his people. Education was simple but earnest. Boys learned the Quran at the side of local imams, tracing letters on wooden tablets with charcoal. Girls learned the skills of weaving, cooking, and managing a household. Knowledge was practical, tied directly to survival, but it carried within it the seeds of the institutions that would later blossom under Osman's descendants. This cultural life gave the Ottomans more than identity. It gave them resilience. Empires rise and fall through conquest, but they endure only when they cultivate a soul. Under Osman, that soul took form in the rhythm of hammers at the forge, the patterns of woven carpets, the songs sung around the fire, and the whispered prayers in village mosques. For Osman understood that victories would mean little if his people remained fragmented nomads. To last, they needed roots. They needed a culture that bound them together, not just as warriors of a tribe, but as a nation in the making. By protecting markets, fostering craftsmen, encouraging families, and preserving oral traditions, he ensured that his legacy would not rest on battle alone. Thus, in the quiet life of his people, amid bread ovens, market stalls, and songs of wandering shepherds, the foundation of Ottoman culture was laid. It was a world both simple and profound, ordinary lives made extraordinary by the vision of a leader who knew that the strength of a state lay not only in its armies, but in the daily lives of its people. By the second decade of the 14th century, Osman was no longer the vigorous warrior who had led charges at Bapheus. Age and years of campaign began to weigh heavily upon him. The man who once thundered across battlefields on horseback now walked with slower steps, his beard graying, his voice quieter but no less commanding. The seasons of war had left their mark on his body. The exact nature of Osman's illness is lost to history, but chronicles speak of a lingering weakness, a sickness that confined him more and more often to his tent. His strength waned, though his mind remained sharp. Each morning, he summoned reports from the front, asking after soldiers, villages, and the progress of sieges. Though his body faltered, his spirit clung fiercely to the dream he had carried since youth, the rise of a lasting state. It was during these years that Osman leaned increasingly upon his son, Orhan. From boyhood, Orhan had been raised in the ways of war and governance. He had ridden with the cavalry, fought in skirmishes, and sat beside his father in council. Now, as Osman's health declined, Orhan stepped naturally into the role of deputy, carrying out campaigns on behalf of his father. Villages once defended by Osman's sword were now secured by Orhan's leadership. The transition was subtle but steady, a quiet shifting of power from one generation to the next. Still, Osman was careful not to relinquish his authority without guidance. In council, lying upon cushions and propped up by attendants, he spoke to Orhan in deliberate words. He reminded him that conquest alone would not sustain their people. Justice and faith must remain at the heart of rule. The sword may win a field, he is said to have told his son, but it is law and mercy that keep it. These lessons would shape Orhan's reign as surely as the sword shaped his arm. As Osman's illness deepened, the atmosphere in Söğüt grew heavy with anticipation. Warriors whispered about succession, elders prayed for stability, families looked anxiously toward the future. Yet Osman's careful preparation reassured them. They had seen Orhan's capability. They trusted the continuity of leadership. The tribe would not fall into chaos. In the final months of his life, Osman called Orhan to his side. The moment was solemn. Inside the dimly lit tent, elders and warriors gathered, their faces lined with grief and respect. Osman, frail but resolute, lifted the banner and sword that had been the emblems of his life. With trembling hands, he placed them in Orhan's grasp. The curved blade gleamed in the firelight. The fabric of the banner rippled softly. It was more than a transfer of objects. It was the passing of destiny itself. Those present remembered the silence that followed, broken only by Osman's weak but unwavering words. A charge to uphold faith, to protect the people, and to honor justice. For Orhan, it was not merely a father's command but a sacred trust. He knelt, pressing his forehead to the ground, accepting the burden of rule. Not long after, Osman's strength gave way entirely. Surrounded by his family and closest companions, he breathed his last in the year 1323. His passing was mourned not as the death of a chieftain, but as the end of an age, the close of the beginning chapter in the story of an empire. The mourning spread through the camp and beyond. Women wept openly, warriors lowered their swords in respect, and prayers rose from mosques and households alike. Villagers lit lanterns at dusk, their glow flickering like stars across the plain. Elders spoke softly of the shepherd boy who had become a warrior, the warrior who had become a leader, the leader who had become the father of a dynasty. Osman was laid to rest with dignity, his burial simple yet solemn. His people remembered him not for riches or palaces, but for the justice he upheld, the faith he embodied, and the vision he passed to his heirs. His grave, in time, would become a place of reverence, visited by generations who claimed him as the root of their empire. Though his life ended, his story did not. In Orhan, and in the empire that would grow from his dream, Osman's presence endured. His death was not a conclusion but a bridge, carrying the Ottomans from fragile beginnings into the dawn of greatness. And so, the founder of a dynasty departed the world as he had lived in it, humbly, faithfully, and with his gaze fixed on a destiny larger than himself. The people who had once been mere wanderers now stood as the inheritors of a future, their path lit by the legacy of the man they called Osman Gazi. Osman I left the world in 1323, but his shadow stretched far beyond the years of his life. He had begun with almost nothing, a wandering tribe, a handful of warriors, and a dream. Yet from that modest beginning, he carved the first stones of a foundation that would carry the weight of centuries. His name, simple and unadorned, became the very name of an empire. Ottoman. Osman's greatest legacy was not measured in territory alone. At his death, the lands he controlled were still modest compared to the empires of old. But what mattered was not the size of his domain, it was the strength of the idea he left behind. He had given his people unity where once there was division. He had given them laws where once there was chaos. And he had given them faith in a destiny that transcended the limits of their small beginnings. The chronicles of later centuries would remember Osman as Osman Ghazi, Osman the warrior of faith. To his followers, he was not just a leader, but a chosen instrument of God's will. His victories were retold around campfires, his judgments cited as examples of fairness, his life held up as proof that humility, devotion, and courage could shape history. Even his dreams became part of the legend. The vision of a tree growing from his chest, shading the world with its branches. Whether myth or miracle, it became the perfect symbol for the empire that sprouted from his seed. The institutions he planted endured. His early laws, the Kanun, became the framework upon which later sultans built vast legal systems. His policy of pragmatism, balancing faith with tolerance, strength with justice, allowed conquered peoples to adapt to Ottoman rule rather than resist it endlessly. His emphasis on loyalty and merit ensured that warriors and administrators alike served with dedication, knowing that honor and reward were bound together. Culturally, Osman's reign gave his people more than survival. It gave them identity. Under his protection, markets flourished, artisans thrived, and families found stability. Oral traditions wove his deeds into songs and stories, and those stories hardened into the memory of a nation. He turned a fragile tribe into the nucleus of a civilization. In the decades that followed, his successors would expand upon this foundation. Orhan, his son, would capture Bursa, transforming it into the first great Ottoman capital. Others would follow, Murad, Bayezid, Mehmed, each carrying the banner further, until at last the walls of Constantinople themselves fell before the Ottomans. Yet through every triumph, every expansion, every monument built, the empire always looked back to Osman as its root. The tomb of Osman in Bursa, simple compared to the palaces and mosques that later adorned the empire, became a place of pilgrimage. New sultans, upon ascending the throne, would visit his grave, bow their heads, and symbolically receive his blessing before beginning their reign. For centuries, the line of rulers traced its legitimacy not only through conquest, but through the memory of the shepherd warrior who first gave them a name. His legacy was also spiritual. Osman represented the fusion of sword and prayer, of worldly leadership and divine mission. To his followers, he proved that greatness could rise from faith, that justice could coexist with conquest, that a simple tribe could carry the weight of a destiny larger than themselves. In him, they saw the embodiment of hope, that even the smallest beginnings could lead to a vast horizon. As we close his chapter, the final image lingers. Osman, old and weary, placing his sword and banner into the hands of his son Orhan. In that moment, one life ended, but a dynasty began. Orhan would take the flame and carry it forward, expanding the state, securing its first true cities, and turning his father's dream into reality. Thus, the story of Osman I is not only the story of a man. It is the story of a beginning, the first page of an empire that would last 6 centuries, spanning continents, shaping faiths, and leaving a mark upon the world. His reign was humble, his realm small, but his vision eternal. Osman I, the humble warrior who gave birth to an empire. From him, the Ottomans rose, and with his son Orhan, the story continues.